It's not one thing, it was many things. But I did not like that he'd had meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. He was evil personified. I had nightmares about it afterwards.
She had a fortune most people cannot even picture. Tens of billions of dollars, a sprawling lakeside estate outside Seattle, 3 grown children, and a husband the entire planet called a genius. From the outside, Melinda French Gates looked like a woman who had won every version of the game. But behind the walls of that house, she has since said she was quietly falling apart, and it has taken her almost 3 decades and a year of explosive new revelations to finally lay out the whole truth of why her marriage ended. Melinda French met Bill Gates in 1987, when she joined Microsoft as a young product manager, and he was already running the company he'd co-founded a decade earlier. They married in Hawaii on New Year's Day, 1994. Their first daughter, Jennifer, arrived in 1996, followed by their son Rory in 1999 and their youngest daughter, Phoebe, a few years after that. By any outward measure, theirs was one of the most envied partnerships in the world, not just a marriage, but a business and philanthropic alliance that eventually grew into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations on the planet. Before any of that, Melinda had been a rising star inside Microsoft herself. She'd studied computer science and economics, joined the company in 1987, and climbed to general manager of information products before stepping back in the mid-1990s as she started a family. That early career mattered later, because it meant she understood the company, and the culture inside it, from the inside out, which made what she'd eventually learn about her husband's conduct there even harder to swallow. For most of the 2000s and 2010s, the public version of that marriage was almost cartoonishly perfect. 2 brilliant, generous people working side by side to fight disease and poverty. What the public didn't know was that, behind that image, trust between them had already started to erode, quietly, slowly, and in ways it would take years to fully surface. In 2011, 3 years after Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to soliciting a minor for prostitution, Bill Gates began meeting with him. By Gates's own later account, he was introduced to Epstein by people he trusted, drawn in by Epstein's pitch that he could help raise billions of dollars for global health causes. Gates has said he was aware Epstein had faced some kind of legal trouble, what he later called, in his own words, an 18-month thing, but that he didn't look into it closely enough before accepting the relationship. According to Gates's own later testimony, the 2 men met repeatedly between 2011 and 2014. Dinners, flights on a private jet, time spent together in New York, Washington, Germany, and France. Gates has firmly denied ever staying overnight with Epstein or visiting his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But the meetings were real, they were frequent, and by his own admission they continued for 3 years after he knew Epstein was a convicted sex offender. Melinda, by her own account, wanted no part of it from the start. She has said she met Epstein exactly once, at his Manhattan townhouse, and the encounter left her so unsettled that she told Bill afterward she never wanted him near the man again. Gates himself has since publicly credited her instincts, telling Gates Foundation staff that Melinda was always skeptical of his association with Epstein, an acknowledgement that effectively confirms what she has been saying in interviews for years. The Epstein meetings weren't the only behavior that later came under scrutiny. A 2019 New York Times investigation, drawing on accounts from 6 current and former employees of Microsoft, the foundation, and the firm that manages the Gates family fortune, described a pattern of Gates pursuing women who worked for him over the years. In one widely reported instance from 2006, after watching a female Microsoft employee give a presentation, Gates emailed her to ask her to dinner, adding a line that revealed he knew exactly how the invitation would land. If it made her uncomfortable, he wrote, she should simply pretend it never happened. According to people familiar with the exchange, it did make her uncomfortable, and she did exactly that. A similar pattern reportedly played out at the Gates Foundation itself, where Gates is said to have approached an employee during a work trip and asked her to dinner. The Times noted that the employees it spoke with did not describe his conduct as predatory or career-threatening, but several said it created an uncomfortable atmosphere, one that sat awkwardly alongside Melinda's very public, very deliberate work championing women's empowerment on the world stage. Gates's representatives have denied some specific characterizations in that reporting, including any suggestion that he socialized with young women at Epstein's gatherings. In late October 2019, a New York Times investigation laid out the scope of those meetings for the public for the first time. Melinda has said reading it brought back memories of deeply painful periods in her marriage. Within days, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, she had begun making calls to divorce attorneys, trying to understand what her options were if the marriage didn't survive what was coming. The Epstein story wasn't the only thing breaking open that season. Around the same time, Microsoft's board of directors received a letter from a company engineer alleging she'd had a relationship with Bill Gates roughly 2 decades earlier, while he was still running the company. The board hired an outside law firm to investigate. By March 2020, with that inquiry still underway, Gates announced he was stepping down from Microsoft's board entirely. A spokesperson for Gates later told the Journal there had indeed been an affair almost 20 years ago which ended amicably, and insisted the board departure was unrelated, that he'd simply decided to focus more on philanthropy. For over a year after that, Bill and Melinda kept the unraveling of their marriage private while they worked through the practical details. In February 2020, during a trip to New Mexico, Melinda finally told him she wanted to live separately. By her account, he was sad but not surprised. On May 3, 2021, the couple announced their divorce in a joint statement, ending 27 years of marriage. 3 months later, on August 2, a judge in King County, Washington made it official. At the time of the split, the couple's combined fortune was estimated at roughly $130 billion, making theirs one of the largest divorces in modern history. On the day the divorce was announced, stock filings showed Bill transferring about $2.4 billion in securities to Melinda in a single afternoon, including major stakes in Canadian National Railway and the Coca-Cola bottler FEMSA. A real estate portfolio worth well over $100 million had to be divided as well, anchored by Xanadu 2.0, their roughly 66,000 square foot home outside Seattle that had taken nearly 7 years and tens of millions of dollars to build. The hardest asset to divide wasn't a house or a stock portfolio. It was the foundation itself, a philanthropic engine with more than $50 billion behind it. For a while, Bill and Melinda tried to keep co-chairing it together despite the divorce. By the summer of 2024, that arrangement collapsed. Melinda announced she was leaving the foundation entirely, and shortly after, the organization dropped her name, becoming simply the Gates Foundation rather than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As part of her exit, Bill committed roughly $12.5 billion to fund her independent philanthropic work, an enormous sum, and also a final, symbolic closing of a 25-year chapter of her identity. In April 2025, while promoting her memoir the next day, Melinda appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. When he asked what she'd learned from Bill's affair about what she wanted from a marriage, she didn't dodge the question. She said she'd learned she wanted a relationship built on trust, that both partners have to be honest with each other, and that without honesty there's no real intimacy or trust to speak of. And so in the end, she told him, I had to go. In her memoir, she went further, describing years of therapy spent trying to understand why she had tolerated things she shouldn't have, and how she had slowly become less and less herself inside the marriage. She has said she didn't like the person that environment had shaped her into, and that leaving was, in part, an attempt to become herself again. That was, by her own telling at the time, the actual reason. Not one single scandal, but an accumulation of broken trust she eventually decided she could no longer absorb. What nobody quite expected was how much more of the story would surface less than a year later. Throughout late 2025 and into 2026, the Department of Justice released millions of pages of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, following a bipartisan act of Congress compelling their disclosure. Bill Gates's name appeared hundreds of times. Among the material were 2017 text messages between Epstein and an advisor to Gates. In them, the advisor told Epstein that Gates wanted to talk to him but that his wife won't let him, adding moments later that Gates loves you and feels bad about a charitable fund idea his wife wouldn't allow him to pursue. The exchange showed, in writing, exactly the dynamic Melinda had described in interviews for years. Bill drawn toward Epstein, and her actively, repeatedly blocking it. Separately, the files included 2 draft emails Epstein had written to himself in 2013, in which he made unverified claims about Gates's personal life, including allegations involving extramarital activity and a sexually transmitted infection, claims Gates's representatives have called false. The emails also referenced Gates's longtime science advisor, Boris Nikolic, who had a personal friendship with Epstein. The pressure from the document releases reached his own foundation. In late February 2026, Gates held a previously scheduled town hall with Gates Foundation staff and used part of it to address the Epstein questions head-on. According to the Wall Street Journal, which reviewed a recording of the meeting, Gates told staff it had been a huge mistake to spend time with Epstein and apologized to anyone drawn into the fallout because of it. He was emphatic that he hadn't done anything illicit and had never spent time with any of Epstein's victims. But he also said something he had never said publicly before, that he'd had 2 affairs with women, both later discovered by Epstein, and that knowing what he knows now makes the whole association 100 times worse. He told staff that Melinda had always been skeptical of the Epstein relationship, an admission that, intentionally or not, validated everything she had said about objecting to it for years. Then, on June 10, 2026, Gates testified for nearly 6 hours before the House Oversight Committee as part of its broader investigation into the handling of the Epstein case. In his opening statement, he called meeting Epstein a grave error in judgment and said he never witnessed or had any indication that Epstein was engaged in ongoing criminal conduct. He also told lawmakers that Epstein had learned of his infidelity and tried to use it as leverage to keep Gates engaged with him, an effort Gates said failed, but one he acknowledged showed how Epstein operated. He said his relationship with Epstein, by his own account, ended for good in December 2014. None of this changes what Melinda has said for years. If anything, it confirms it. She has consistently said, going back to her 2022 interview with Gayle King, that she objected to the Epstein relationship and made that objection clear to Bill directly. The 2017 texts back that up almost word for word. She has consistently said there was more than one instance of infidelity she didn't feel was hers to detail publicly, deflecting the question back to Bill. His own February 2026 admission of 2 affairs, on top of the Microsoft investigated relationship from 2000, backs that up too. Speaking to NPR's Wild Card podcast in early February 2026, just weeks before her ex-husband's public apology, Melinda was asked directly about the renewed scrutiny. She said the people named in the Epstein files, including her former husband, are the ones who need to answer for those associations, not her. She also said that going back through the latest documents had brought up memories of some genuinely painful times in her life. It was a measured answer, not a dramatic one, but it lined up with everything she has said since the divorce, that the explaining was his to do, and that her job was simply to tell the truth about what she experienced. The woman describing all of this in 2025 and 2026 is not the same one who has said she once lay on her bedroom floor unable to get up, in the depths of panic attacks she'd never experienced before in her life. Since leaving the Gates Foundation, she has run her own philanthropic organization, Pivotal Ventures, putting more than $1 billion toward causes focused on women and girls, including a recent $250 million commitment to underfunded areas of women's health research. She has also moved on personally. In late October 2024, she was photographed in New York City holding hands with Philip Vaughn, a tech entrepreneur 12 years her junior who founded the craft beer delivery company Teva and, in a small twist, once worked at Microsoft himself, years after Melinda had left the company. The two made their first official public appearance together at the Clooney Foundation's Albies Awards in London in October 2025, where Melinda was honored for her decades of work on women's health and gender equity. She has kept most details of the relationship private, but she hasn't hidden her happiness, telling people simply that she is very, very happy, and telling Colbert with a smile that things have been pretty great. In interviews around the release of her memoir, Melinda has also been candid about the years leading up to the split, telling people that she had found herself losing a sense of self in the decade or so before her marriage actually fell apart, a slow erosion rather than a single dramatic break. That framing matters, because it's consistent with everything that has surfaced since. Not one isolated betrayal, but a long accumulation of moments where she compromised pieces of herself to hold the marriage together, until she eventually decided she couldn't keep doing it. Bill Gates, for his part, has also moved into a new chapter. He has been linked in recent reporting to Paula Hurd, the widow of former Oracle co-CEO Mark Hurd, with the two appearing together at public events over the past year. Where Melinda has used her platform to speak openly, often uncomfortably so, about what went wrong, Bill's public reckoning has come almost entirely under pressure. First through journalist reporting, then through a Wall Street Journal-reviewed recording of his own remarks to Foundation staff, and finally under oath before Congress. The contrast between the two approaches has become, in its own way, part of the story the public has watched unfold.